It's time to read a chapter from the book of Dark Things the American Government Has Done, which is actually a collection of several volumes with more on the way. This story takes place in the Philippines, a country which was controlled by the United States from 1898 to 1941, when it was invaded by Imperial Japan. A few years later, the United States kicked out the Japanese and then generously granted independence to the Philippines. Except it wasn't actually that generous, because they pressured the Philippines into signing something called the Bell Trade Act, which gave the United States and the Philippines equal control over all Filipino natural resources. And even though the country was technically independent, their subsequent presidential elections were funded by the CIA to install regimes backed by the United States. So now that I've given you an extreme oversimplification of the history of the Philippines, let's get into the vampire stuff. Overseeing the CIA's influence on the Philippines was an operative named Edward Lansdale. Prior to World War II, Lansdale was living in San Francisco and working in advertising, which is fitting because he looks like Don Draper if he somehow smoked twice as many cigarettes. And when the war came around, Lansdale's skills in advertising earned him a position in the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA in 1945. By 1950, the somewhat independent Filipino government was fighting a communist guerrilla movement called the Hukbalahap. The members of the movement were known as the Hooks, which is extremely convenient because it saves me from having to say Hukbalahap for the rest of this video. The Hooks had formed their group to fight the occupying forces of Japan, but when those forces were all gone, they shifted to fighting the new Filipino government. So Edward Lansdale was brought in to assist the armed forces of the Philippines in their fight against the Hooks. Although he did a lot more than that, as he went on to completely run the presidential campaign of Ramon Magsaysay, who won the presidency thanks to Lansdale and millions of dollars from the American government. Lansdale and the CIA went on to write all of Magsaysay's speeches and oversee his government's policies. Lansdale's Wikipedia page describes him as a friend of Magsaysay, but that seems a little presumptive considering it's been reported that Lansdale once physically assaulted Magsaysay when he read a speech that wasn't written by the CIA. But even if those two did bicker like an old married couple from time to time, they actually managed to get a lot done, particularly in their fight against the Hooks, where Lansdale developed the early forms of modern psychological warfare. He later wrote, "Conventional military men think of combat Psy-war almost exclusively in terms of leaflets or broadcasts appealing to the enemy to surrender. Early on, I realized that Psy-war had a wider potential than that. And the wider potential he's referring to in that incredibly ominous sentence involved taking a look at Filipino mythology. Lansdale and his men studied the superstitions of Filipino peasants to discover what freaked them out. The first thing they tried was something that Lansdale called the Eye of God, which involved painting a cryptic symbol on the houses of people who they suspected were working with the Hooks. I guess the idea was that the Hook sympathizers would think that the symbol was a mark of death from some ancient demon. Except it sounds like the Eye of God was just something that Lansdale made up with no actual link to Filipino myth. But maybe he thought their stuff was too boring and was trying to add to the lore. Another strategy involved flying planes over Hook-controlled areas and broadcasting mysterious curses onto the villagers below, attempting to prevent them from joining forces with the Hooks in fear of spiritual evils. But I feel like the sight and sound of a plane flying above them might have tarnished the illusion on that one. As ridiculous as those strategies were, Lansdale's magnum opus was soon to come. One of the things his men discovered in their search through Filipino mythology was a vampire-like creature called the Aswang. Existing in Filipino legend since at least the 1500s, the Aswang is basically the bringer of all evil things. And although it is said to suck the blood of humans, it doesn't resemble the vampires of Western culture, typically looking more like this. Jesus Christ! Alright, get that off the screen. We'll go back to the vampires. Good lord. Apparently, the Aswang is often said to lurk on rooftops at night, sticking their long tongues through holes in the roofs of houses, using those tongues to latch onto humans and suck out their insides. The whole thing really makes Dracula feel like a fairy tale. Anyway, Lansdale liked the idea of the Aswang and decided to use it for one of his psyops. A squadron of about 100 to 300 Hook fighters had set up camp near a village, supposedly forcing the locals to cooperate. So Lansdale sent in some Filipino psyop agents that his men had trained. They were ordered to plant stories among the villagers about an Aswang living in the area. And I'm sure the villagers weren't suspicious at all when a bunch of new people showed up and immediately started talking about a monster. The hope was that the villagers would pass the stories on to the Hooks. A few nights later, the men Lansdale had trained set up an ambush along a trail and waited for a Hook patrol group to come along. Then they silently grabbed the last man in the patrol and staged an Aswang killing. In his memoirs, Lansdale described it like this. They punctured his neck with 2 holes, vampire fashion, held the body up by the heels, drained it of blood, and put the corpse back on the trail. When the Hooks returned to look for the missing man and found their bloodless comrade, every member of the patrol believed that the Aswang had got him, and that one of them would be next if they remained on that hill. When daylight came, the whole Hook squadron moved out of the vicinity. So in an effort to scare away the Hooks using their superstitions, Lansdale conducted one of the most brutal murders you've ever heard. Truly a pioneer of psychological warfare. Interestingly enough, one researcher says that the region they conducted this operation in had a completely different perception of the Aswang, viewing it as a creature that ate flesh instead of sucking blood. He said, quote, "It's not even clear if the Hooks believed it was an Aswang killing the people, or if they were horrified at the desecration of the deceased by the CIA-advised troops." So the whole thing about the Aswang might have been completely obsolete, because the murder was so incredibly horrifying that it scared away the Hooks even if they knew humans were doing it. I guess the greatest monster of all truly is mankind. In the end, the Hooks were defeated without any more of them having their blood drained out of their neck. By 1954, they were essentially non-existent. In 1957, President McSaysay died in a plane crash, while his dear friend Edward Lansdale had been transferred to Vietnam. He was sent there to help end the military efforts of North Vietnam like he had with the Hooks. But one quick glance at the history books will tell you that he was not successful. I guess vampires don't work on the Viet Cong. Special thanks to this commenter for suggesting the topic of this video. Now please consider subscribing or I'll show you that picture of the Aswang again.